year 1324, the king of the powerful and gold-rich West African state of Mali, a Muslim named Mansa Musa, set out to undertake the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that all able-bodied Muslims are required to make at least once in their lives if they can afford to. Mansa Musa could certainly afford the journey. His party was massive, a gargantuan caravan that included thousands of soldiers, attendants, subjects, and slaves, as well as 100 camels carrying satchels of gold. Mansa Musa bestowed lavish gifts on all those who hosted him along the way, and during a 3-month stopover in Cairo, he distributed so much gold that its value in the Cairo markets declined by 25%. Mansa Musa was deeply moved by his pilgrimage to Mecca, and once he returned to Mali, he built beautiful mosques in the trading cities of his realm. The mosques were soon frequented by Muslim merchants, and Musa sent bright young students from Mali to study with distinguished Islamic scholars all over North Africa. He also established madrasas in Mali, employing leading Arabian and North African teachers, including 4 teachers who could trace their ancestry back to the Prophet Muhammad himself. All of this helped make the imported religion of Islam much better known in Mali, and it made Mali one of the most famous centers of Islamic learning anywhere in the Muslim world. And yet, until the late 20th century, Western historians and other outsiders routinely overlooked or discounted Mali and the other great states of sub-Saharan Africa when considering the rise of human civilization. As we have seen, many important developments in the history of civilization took place in Africa. The rise and impressive longevity of Egyptian civilization and its often stormy relationship with contiguous African states like the Nubians. The Punic Wars between the Phoenician colony of Carthage and the Romans, and the spread of Islam across North Africa to Morocco. All of these developments took place primarily in North Africa, but there were also tremendous developments underway in the regions to the south of the Sahara Desert that had significant effects on other parts of the world. So let's consider the trajectory of sub-Saharan African history, including the rise and fall of great kingdoms like that of Mali, and the role that the environment played in influencing these processes. The Sahara dominates the northern third of the African continent, but the south is much more diverse, with everything from high alpine mountains to arid deserts, from dense tropical jungle to open grassy savanna plains. The savanna has always been the most hospitable environment for humans, and it was in the savanna of East Africa that hominids and early humans first evolved and prospered. The savanna stretches across the continent in great belts, just south of the Sahara, around the mountains and lakes of East Africa, and across southern Africa to the Kalahari Desert. Between the northern and southern savanna belts lies a region of dense tropical rainforest, sometimes called jungle. Like their counterparts in Amazonia, Africa's jungle soils are poor because of the constant leaching of nutrients and erosion caused by frequent torrential rain. The jungle is also an unhealthy place, harboring mosquitoes that carry malaria and yellow fever, and tsetse flies that cause sleeping sickness. For the first nearly 200,000 years of their occupation of sub-Saharan Africa, humans survived by foraging. But eventually some communities made the transition to farming, domesticating crops and animals that were well adapted to these various environments. The savanna was perfect for growing cereals like sorghum and millet, and in the jungle, slash and burn agriculture yielded root crops like yam and cassava. Particular cultural patterns emerged in these early agrarian communities that can still be found in many African societies today. The extended family, for example, became the foundation for larger social structures because all members of a tribe could trace their lineage back to a common ancestor, and the status of each person's lineage determined the role he or she played in the community. Lineage was also the basis for much larger political structures, chiefdoms and kingdoms, in that seniority and status determined who would be chief or king. These larger structures possessed all the features we have come to expect in agrarian civilizations: successful farming, large populations, rigid hierarchies, bureaucracies, long-distance exchanges, and hereditary rulers who combined sacred and secular power. Also in line with most other civilizations, African societies were mostly patrilineal, with descent traced through fathers to sons in high-status kinship groups, giving men control of public power. Yet perhaps 15% of African societies were matrilineal, with descent passed down through the mother's side of the family. These communities existed mostly in the rainforest, and it is intriguing to ponder the role that that particular environment might have played in this social innovation. In both types of societies, marriage was traditionally accompanied by an exchange of bride wealth, a dowry paid by the husband in the form of money, goods, or cattle to the family of his wife, which effectively gave the husband rights in his new family. Many women had conspicuous power in sub-Saharan societies, serving as officials, political advisors, religious leaders, even soldiers. The women surrounding the chief or king, his wife, mother, and sisters were often the real powers behind the throne, serving as mediators and unifiers of the various lineages in the community. Reflecting the beliefs of their Paleolithic ancestors, native religions in sub-Saharan Africa were polytheistic. Although most included a high creator god, that god remained remote from everyday affairs, so people generally engaged with lesser divinities, with nature spirits and ancestor spirits that needed to be regularly propitiated to avoid illness or crop failure. Rituals and sacrifices were carried out to keep the gods happy, often presided over by female shamans and spirit mediums. But the arrival of Christianity and Islam had a dramatic impact on these beliefs and practices. Many Africans did remain faithful to their ancient beliefs, but like Mansa Musa, many others gradually adopted Islam or Christianity, syncretizing many of these ancient practices. The spread of Christianity into northeastern Africa during the late Roman period gradually replaced ancient worship and funerary practices in that region. The Muslim Arab invasions of North Africa after 632 of the Common Era added another religious layer, although North Africa proved much harder to conquer for Islamic forces than Persia or the Middle East. The Arabs were only able to overcome the combined forces of Byzantines and Libyans after a series of bloody battles. Possibly applying a Greek term, the Arabs came to refer to the Libyans as Barbar, or barbarians, and this is the origin of the term Berbers. The impact of the Arab invasions further to the south was uneven. The near ubiquitous demand for slaves, however, ensured connections between Africa's Mediterranean and sub-Saharan regions. This meant that, unlike in the north, the spread of Islam into the southern Sahara regions was not the result of conquest, but either by voluntary adoption of the religion or the deliberate conversion of rulers in order to facilitate the slave trade. The change was not one-sided, however. As we will see, Islam went through a transformation of its own in the process. Farming in Africa's early agrarian era was supplemented by fishing and foraging throughout the continent, even in the Sahara, which during the Holocene contained many lakes and rivers. But significant climate change, beginning around 3000 BCE, turned large sections of the Sahara into arid desert, which might have acted as a stimulus to the expansion of agriculture further south. This change marks the end of the wet phase of the Holocene, and by 2000 BCE, much of North Africa had become as arid as it is today, emptying the Sahara of people, except for the inhabitants of the few remaining oases. This had the effect of essentially creating two Africas, north and south, and inhibiting significant contact between them for the next 2 millennia. Bioarchaeologists have identified 4 independent centers of early farming south of the Sahara: the highlands of Ethiopia, central Sudan, and the savanna and forests of West Africa. Ethiopian highland farmers cultivated millet, sesame, and mustard. Sudanese farmers grew sorghum, millet, rice, peas, and nuts. In the West African savanna, oil palms, peas, and yams thrived, and in the forests, farmers grew bananas and coffee. Sometime around 1000 BCE, new strands of wheat and barley diffused into Africa from Southwest Asia, as did domesticated cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. A technological revolution occurred in the 7th century BCE when iron metallurgy spread into sub-Saharan Africa. It's evidenced by the great ironworking centre that developed at Meroe in the Nubian kingdom of Kush, where huge iron slag heaps can still be found today. Archaeologists have also found evidence of independent ironworking at Nok in central Nigeria. Their smelters were able to produce high-quality steel with a carbon content equal to the iron of Egypt and Rome. Iron workers enjoyed high status because they were thought to have magical powers. Their work increased agricultural productivity by replacing stone tools with metal ones, leading to population growth, craft specialization, more trade, and the evolution of more complex social and economic structures. Ironworking was also an important factor in the so-called Bantu migrations, although our understanding of this important process continues to evolve. In the 19th century, historians realized that the languages and cultures of many sub-Saharan African societies were strikingly similar, suggesting they were descended from a common ancestor society that had expanded out from its original homeland. The name Bantu, which simply means people, is a general label applied to hundreds of ethnic groups that speak these interrelated languages. These Bantu migrations were more than just a linguistic phenomenon. Historians believe they also led to the diffusion of many important technologies, including new agricultural techniques, pottery, and iron metallurgy. Dating the expansion was difficult, but because of the limited linguistic divergence of the roughly 600 Bantu languages that have been discovered, it was thought that it probably took place quickly and relatively recently, between the late 1st millennium BCE and the early 1st millennium CE. The border regions of modern Nigeria and Cameroon were identified as the home of the Proto-Bantu, from where archaeologists traced the direction of Bantu expansion eastwards towards the Great Lakes and Indian Ocean coast, and also south along the west and east coasts. More recently, a closer analysis of Bantu languages, coupled with more reliably dated archaeological work, has led to a more nuanced reconstruction of the Bantu expansion. It is now believed that the expansion began much earlier, perhaps in the 3rd millennium BCE. Radiometric dating of ironworking sites has shown that iron metallurgy in various parts of sub-Saharan Africa developed independently and was not acquired from some other location. So now there is a sense that the Bantu expansion was a gradual process lasting many centuries rather than a large-scale migration of iron-using farmers that took place in a relatively brief period. However it occurred, the spread of iron-using farming societies transformed lifeways throughout much of Central and Southern Africa. Sedentary populations increased, society became more complex, and trade expanded to meet growing demand for iron and other products. In certain locations where the appropriate Goldilocks conditions were in place, where products from different ecological zones could be exchanged and transported by water or land routes, for example, towns with economies based on trade, farming, and manufacturing appeared. Some of them evolved into larger political structures. Such conditions were certainly in place by the start of the Common Era in Ethiopia, a source of valuable trade goods for thousands of years before the first kingdoms appeared there. The ancient Egyptians had sent expeditions to Ethiopia to trade for spices, gold, and animals, and Arab merchants had established a trading settlement on the Eritrean coast as early as 800 BCE. By the Common Era, a state known as Aksum had emerged to dominate Red Sea trade. Aksum reached its peak in the 4th century of the Common Era under the ruler Ezana, who converted to Christianity at about the same time the Roman Emperor Constantine did. Centuries later, Syrian monks came to Aksum and also converted much of the rural population to Christianity. But just to complicate matters, in 615 an Aksum king gave refuge to followers of Muhammad who were being persecuted in Arabia, an event that marks the beginning of Islamic expansion into East Africa. By the 8th century, Islamic groups had taken over Aksum's position as a major trading center. Aksum rulers moved into the interior of Ethiopia and established a new Christian state there known as the Zagwe dynasty. In response to the Muslim capture of Jerusalem in 1187, a semi-legendary saintly Zagwe emperor called Lalibela constructed 11 magnificent Christian churches that were hewn directly from rock in a town that came to bear the emperor's name. This was no mean feat, given that the rock is porous volcanic basalt, so that drainage was a big problem. Workers started at the top, traced the outline of the church into the rock, then literally dug down into the basalt until the exterior was made, hollowing out the interior last. The builders also made canals and drainage trenches, sloped the roofs of the churches to aid water runoff, and used hydraulic systems to fill cisterns and baptismal pools. One of the first Europeans to see the churches was the Portuguese priest Francisco Alvarez in the 1520s, who was so enthusiastic in his written description of them that he thought he would be disbelieved in Europe. He wrote, "It seems to me that I shall not be believed, but I swear by God, whose power I am in, that all I have written is the truth." Far to the west of Ethiopia, in the western savannah, the appearance of complex states along the Niger River was also closely associated with the expansion of trade, this time using trans-Saharan routes that led to the Mediterranean. The ironworking Nok culture was the first complex state to appear in what is Nigeria today. Nok culture covered a huge area of about 45,000 square miles, sustained by successful farming for about 700 years between 500 BCE and 200 CE. For the first 2 centuries, Nok farmers coexisted peacefully with the Berber nomads in the Sahara, but the appearance of walled settlements around 300 BCE suggests increasing conflict between them. This culminated in the appearance of the seriously large town of Geno, which became an important center for trade, fishing, and agriculture. Founded in an exceptionally fertile area of the Niger Delta, by 250 BCE, Geno was a walled city, 80 acres in area, surrounded by a cluster of villages, each of which specialized in a particular craft. Geno prospered because of favorable Goldilocks conditions, its fertile location certainly, but also the fact that it had easy access to both the salt and mineral resources of the Sahara to the north and to the animal and plant products and gold in the forest zone to the south, making it the ideal place to control long-distance trade across the Sahara. Because of the obvious difficulty of the trans-Saharan routes, the first attempts by Mediterranean peoples to make contact with sub-Saharan Africa were by sea. We know of a mid-5th century BCE expedition launched by the Carthaginians and led by a high magistrate named Hanno, which sailed south down the Atlantic coast of Africa. It reached at least as far south as the Senegal River and possibly Mount Cameroon. The date at which sub-Saharan Africa was reconnected to the Mediterranean coast by trans-Saharan trade is less certain, but various pieces of evidence suggest this occurred during the early centuries of the Common Era. With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, this trade declined, but it was revived again by Byzantine and Arab traders using the Arabian dromedary camel as the main beast of burden. Building on flourishing agriculture and trade, a new kingdom emerged just to the south of the Sahara in the Upper Niger region in the 4th century CE. It was named after its legendary war chief, Ghana, and over the next 4 centuries became wealthy and powerful. The king of Ghana monopolized the gold trade and had a nugget big enough to tether his horse to. Salt was also an important export because of its taste and its ability to preserve food and skins. Another valued commodity was slaves, often war captives or kidnapping victims from Central Africa who were in great demand among North African states like Libya. From there, they were exported all over the Eastern Mediterranean. Scholars estimate that between the 8th and early 20th centuries, up to 4 million slaves were transported 1,200 miles across the Sahara Desert. And this, of course, does not include the huge numbers of African slaves sent across the Atlantic. Thanks to all its commerce, Ghana became so wealthy that in 1067, an Arab chronicler described a Ghanaian army of 200,000 warriors, many of them wearing chainmail. They were ruled by a divine king who was surrounded by retainers carrying gold swords, horses with gold blankets, and dogs with gold collars. Yet within a decade, Ghana was badly weakened by attacks from the nomadic Berbers and lost its dominance of the gold, salt, and slave trades. The eventual successor to Ghana in the region were the Malinke people, who went on to create the enormous and successful Mali Empire. They managed to regain control of the desert gold mines and trade from the Berbers. When gold replaced silver as the main currency of Europe in 1252, Mali became Europe's leading supplier, exporting several tons of gold annually. Mali reached its peak under Mansa Musa, the Muslim ruler who undertook the Hajj to Mecca. Mansa Musa was renowned throughout Africa, Asia, and Europe because of the volume of Malian trade with the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and because of how well organized the multicultural Mali state was, with ministries of finance, justice, agriculture, and foreign affairs. Under his rule, Mali became so famous that Ibn Battuta, the greatest traveler of the Muslim world, and arguably the greatest traveler of all time, given that he traveled an estimated 75,000 miles in 30 years, could not resist a visit to Mali in 1351. But he almost died from food poisoning soon after his arrival. After recovering, Ibn Battuta had mixed feelings about what he saw in Mali. On the one hand, he was deeply impressed by how strictly parents forced their children to learn the Quran, and also by the safety, security, and stability of the Mali kingdom. But on the other, he was dismayed by the continuation of African cultural practices that had been in place for thousands of years before Islam had come to the continent. He was particularly critical of, and I quote, female slaves and servants who went stark naked into the court for all to see, subjects who groveled before the Sultan, beating the ground with their elbows and throwing dust and ashes over their heads, and royal poets who romped about in feathers and bird masks. Like later historians, Ibn Battuta seems to have struggled to reconcile Mali's undeniably impressive achievements with what, in his eyes, were primitive traditions. What he was witnessing, however, was the syncretic transformation of Islam into a uniquely African form that, by absorbing ancient religious practices, was eventually embraced by millions of Africans. Decades after Ibn Battuta's visit, the Kingdom of Mali went into decline, crippled by infighting between factions and pressure from tributary states that demanded independence. By the late 15th century, the kingdom had fallen, yet Mansa Musa had ensured that Islam would continue to have a prominent place in West Africa, including up to the present day. The Songhai Kingdom was one of the states that broke free of Mali's domination. It went on to replace Mali and establish the largest of all the empires of the Western Savannah, ruling from the great trading cities of Timbuktu and Jena. It was superbly administered, with a central bureaucracy and professional military forces, including horsemen in chainmail armor and a navy of Niger River canoes. By the early 16th century, the mosque and madrasa at Timbuktu was recognized as one of the most important centers for Islamic scholarship in all the Muslim world. The undoing of the Songhai was attacked by Moroccans from the north, whose gunpowder weapons quickly overcame the spears, bows, and arrows of the Songhai army. This collapse of the last of the three great West African pre-colonial empires in the late 16th century brought to an end an extraordinary period in the history of sub-Saharan Africa, and indeed in the history of civilization more generally. West Africa was not the only region where states prospered because of successful trade. Along the East African coast, a number of successful trading states also emerged as part of Swahili civilization. Swahili was and is the language spoken along the East Coast. The word Swahili is a Bantu derivation from the Arabic word for coast, Sawahil. The original Swahili farmed in the fertile soils of the region and fished in the many lagoons and rivers, but they also formed and expanded trading contacts with merchants from the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. By the mid-1st century CE, Arab merchants were trading manufactured goods, wine and grain for ivory, rhinoceros horn and tortoise shell. The center of this trade was the port of Rapta, a site that has still not been discovered, which was governed by Arab merchants under the control of a kingdom in Yemen. As more Arab merchants settled along the Swahili coast, Indian Ocean trade thrived, particularly after 300 CE, when superbly made and very fast Arab dhows learned to capitalize on the regularity of the monsoon winds. Between 1000 and 1500, Swahili civilization thrived. Hundreds of city-states were established along the 1,800-mile-long coast from Mogadishu in the north to Sofala in the south, many with deep harbors and strong links to well-established land and maritime trade routes. These were highly competitive commercial states, which meant they never merged into a coherent empire, but they operated independently and peacefully until the arrival of the Portuguese in the 16th century. Swahili artists and urban planners were heavily influenced by the traditions of the Middle East and created beautiful cities with palaces, mosques, public walkways, and fountains. The spectacular palace at Kilwa, built on the edge of a cliff above the ocean, contained 100 rooms and an octagonal bathing pool in one of its many courtyards. The key exports from Kilwa and the other major Swahili port cities were gold, ivory, and slaves. Trading expeditions even arrived from China, notably a fleet under the command of Ming Admiral Zheng He in the 1400s. Admiral Zheng brought with him Chinese porcelain, silk, and lacquerware, and exchanged for this ivory, incense, and exotic animals, including a giraffe that caused quite a stir when it was displayed in the Ming capital of Beijing. The Swahili coast was also well connected to the central and southern inland regions of the continent of Africa, an area that had also been influenced by the spread of Bantu languages and technologies. Early agrarian communities in those regions consisted of scattered homesteads and villages, but during the second millennium CE, some of these also evolved into powerful states. Elites amassed power by acquiring large herds of cattle, which were used to build political networks and to finance regional trade with the Swahili coast. Using stone to construct their homes, palaces, and religious centers, some of these states grew impressively large, like the Mapungubwe, whose elites lived in stone palaces on the hilltops while the commoners farmed the valleys below. The successors to Mapungubwe was Great Zimbabwe, a name that demonstrates the importance of stone because it literally translates to houses of stone. Located on a fertile plateau north of the Limpopo River, Great Zimbabwe constructed a huge complex more than 60 acres in area, which supported perhaps 18,000 people. The central focus was the Great Enclosure, the residence of the royal family, surrounded by stone walls 12 feet thick and 20 feet high, built without mortar. The king presided over an elaborate administrative structure in which his key advisors were all women, mostly his wives and sisters, who kept ritual medicines that protected the king's well-being. Great Zimbabwe collapsed suddenly in 1450 for a variety of reasons, including famine and instability caused by climate change. North of Great Zimbabwe, one of the most powerful of all Africa's pre-colonial states formed at the mouth of the Congo River. This was the Kingdom of Congo. By the time the Portuguese turned up late in the 15th century, Congo was a well-organized state led by a king with a professional army of archers and heavy infantry. After a series of losses against the formidable Congolese forces, the Portuguese finally won the Battle of Mbwila in 1665. They killed the king and many of his courtiers, creating a power vacuum in the country that led eventually to Portuguese conquest of much of the region. This was the beginning of the end of African independence from foreign domination, a situation that would last into the 20th century. As we take leave of Africa on the verge of European colonization, we remember that while most African people were still living in small, scattered farming communities, many impressive and powerful states had risen and fallen all over the continent. In Egypt, certainly, but also in Kush, Aksum, Ethiopia, Ghana, Mali, Great Zimbabwe, and the Congo. These African states were distinctive and homegrown, but they were also vitally engaged with the world beyond Africa. Through trade, they influenced and were influenced by Europe, the Indian Ocean, South Asia, the Muslim world, even China. The fortunes of Africa, like those of much of the rest of the world, were changed forever with the arrival of European explorers and conquerors in the 17th century. The Europeans would turn the great continent into a source